For the few people who are watching my Galactic Heroes videos, I feel a point of clarification needs to be made. I am not approaching these videos having consumed the entirety of the franchise, and I am not choosing my topics of discussion with how compatible those ideas are with future episodes. I am using each episode as a springboard for broader discussions, while consuming them as singular works, not necessarily part of a massive whole. So I may reach conclusions in talking about certain characters or plot points in certain episodes that are not compatible with how the characters or plot points develop down the line. The point of this project is to take each episode of this very political anime, dig into its themes and subtexts, and use those to discuss broader topics that may apply to our real world. Each episode is an icebreaker, not a point of review. And sometimes it'll feel like stretching. Sometimes the politics of an episode can be buried very deep, be obscured in all the science fiction trappings, and oftentimes it's hard to say what the artist behind any given episode used as inspiration. Sometimes it's really hard to find something to talk about. But not today! Yes, let's talk about Rome and the assassination of Julius Caesar. When Tarquin the Proud, the seventh and final king of Rome, was overthrown and exiled in 509 BC, Rome was transformed from a monarchy to a republic, a state run by oligarchy-determined senate. Not a democracy, but certainly better than the tyrannical monarchy that came before, a Rome where power was not centralized into the hands of one person. It was far from perfect, but it was working alright for 4.5 centuries. Then Julius Caesar happened. A war hero whose deeds had made him very popular among the Roman public, he had been given temporary emergency wartime power over the Republic a number of times, a position with the title of dictator. I'm doing the quick version of this story, obviously. We're not even going to get to Cleopatra. In 44 BC, Caesar was appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. This did not sit well with the Senate, both out of fear of a return of the monarchy and, well, wanting their power back. On the 15th of March, 44 BC, Caesar was stabbed 23 times by a group of senators, most famously including Brutus the Younger, who had in the past been good friends with Caesar. While the dictator had been stopped, it wasn't smooth sailing afterwards. Julius Caesar had been a popular leader of the masses, with policies like giving land to the poor and handing out as many wartime clemencies as he could. Rome was already pretty prone to civil wars at this time, and the political assassination of a publicly loved leader by the Senate turned the Republic towards chaos. And when the dust had settled, Caesar's adopted son, Gaius Octavianus, had positioned himself as the first emperor of Rome, turning the name Caesar into a title of leadership, and the Roman Republic became the Roman Empire. Again, I'm greatly simplifying, but that's the gist of it. As you can imagine, when you're so popular your name becomes a political title, a lot of people write about you. It'd be like if before George Washington, the leader of the United States was a guy named Charles President. Caesar himself had a lot of written works about his military campaigns, while over here you have Plutarch writing the life of Julius Caesar sometimes around 96 AD, and Suetonius writing the 12 Caesars in 101 AD. Rome became one of the most written about and documented cultures of its time, with Julius Caesar being a central figure in its history, his assassination being a critical moment. And with that much focus on one man in one moment of time, you can bet it soon inspired works of fiction. Julius Caesar appeared in a few epic poems shortly after his death. Virgil gave Caesar a divine ancestry, a descendant to the goddess Venus, while Lucian's Paracelsia tosses the divine and supernatural, but instead presents Caesar almost as a force of nature. I have a quote, but I'm actually going to save it for later. Both Dante and Chaucer wrote about Caesar favorably, Dante going so far as to send Brutus to hell to be chewed up by Satan for eternity. And, of course, there was William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar in 1599, written in a time when England was having some anxiety about the succession of leadership, as Queen Elizabeth had refused to name a successor, creating fears of civil war. Shakespeare's play, as much about Brutus as it was about Caesar, reflects these anxieties. Hey, leadership woes in Rome cause civil wars. Oh no! This is Rome and Julius Caesar as symbols, as signifier and analogy. To discuss Julius Caesar is to discuss the morality of power. Is it right for a man to hold so much power, even if they're arguably a good person? Orson Welles famously restaged Shakespeare's play in 1937, dressing the characters in modern clothes meant to evoke Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. With examples of modern dictators like Hitler in the public consciousness and the glorification of American democracy over monarchy, Julius Caesar started to appear more often in villainous roles than before. Talbot Mundy's historical fantasy books, Tros of Samothrace, paints Caesar in Rome as tyrannical. The French comic series Asterix has Caesar as a central antagonist. And outside of directly using Caesar as a character, the story of Caesar, his rise and fall, is the foundation for a lot of politically charged fiction. Star Wars, for example, is about a guy who uses emergency military powers to take over the Senate, only to end up betrayed and killed by his closest ally. I'd be remiss not to mention Caesar's Legion in the video game Fallout New Vegas, where a fascist tyrant patterns his post-apocalyptic war tribe off the Roman military, and himself off of Julius Caesar. Of course, there are still positive portrayals of Caesar out there, but we're past the point of jerking him off in epic poems and now have a far more complex relationship with what Caesar represents, the intersection of power and populism. Remember that staging of the Shakespeare play a few years back where Caesar was made into Donald Trump? Even if the assassination scene itself became more of a cathartic fantasy, it's not an off-base metaphor. So with all that in mind, let's look at how Legend of the Galactic Heroes evokes Caesar and Rome. The fifth episode of Legend of the Galactic Heroes, titled the Kastrop Rebellion, involves a small planet led by one Maximilian von Kastrop, rebelling from the greater empire through use of the Artemis Necklace, a network of defense satellites that decimate any ships that try to get close. Reinhard sends his close friend Siegfried and a small contingent of ships to go deal with it. And they do, finding a critical sci-fi flaw in the sci-fi gadget, destroying the necklace in a display that's like a blood-red slash across the sky. Maximilian, realizing the jig is up, tries to find a scapegoat, someone to blame so that the Empire will treat him lightly, but his subjects aren't having any of this and stab him to death. It's clear from the get-go that Maximilian doesn't inspire like Caesar is said to have done. He's a selfish glutton who doesn't care about the people. The Artemis necklace isn't even his. He bought it from the neutral-aligned Phazon Dominion. But everyone's wearing togas, and the buildings are all Roman-style architecture, and Maximilian is a Latin name, and he gets stabbed a bunch, just like Caesar. Shouldn't our Caesar analog be, like Caesar? And that's the point here. Maximilian isn't Caesar, or at least he isn't the pure version of Caesar. He's merely cosplaying as Caesar. He's playing make-believe with power without any care of what it means to have power, endangering everyone else on the planet because he found his dad's gun, which is totally going to keep the grown-ups away, I promise. Yes, the iconography of this episode is meant to evoke Julius Caesar, but the idea of Caesar is unmoored, breaking away from this buffoon in search for a new home. And here comes Reinhard's forces, like a force of nature, as described in Lucian's epic poem. Just so flashes out the thunderbolt shot forth by the winds through clouds, accompanied by the crashing of the heavens and sound of shattered ether. It splits the sky and terrifies the panicked people, searing eyes with slanting flame. Against its own precincts it rages, and with nothing solid stopping its course, both as it falls and then returns great, is the devastation dealt far and wide, before it gathers again its scattered fires. Maximilian may look and act like Caesar, but it's Reinhard and his forces that truly represent the historical Roman figure. His confidence in power, his achievements on the battlefield, the scheming of his peers to end him, and in this episode, his gifts to the common people. In his new role as admiral, Reinhard chooses commoners and lesser nobles to lead his fleets. Maximilian and Reinhard are mirrored in this episode. The corrupt, villainous Caesar versus the man of the people Caesar. Two sides of our cultural perception of this historical figure. Two sides of how we discuss power. The question then is Reinhard destined to the same fate as Caesar? The same fate as Maximilian? Symbolically, the corrupt version of Caesar has been discarded, leaving the pure positive portrayal. But reality isn't that clean. Power will compromise even the most benevolent of leaders, and Reinhard is not the most benevolent, and he is not immune to corruption. Yes, Reinhard is the quote-unquote good version of Caesar, but he's still Caesar. He's still seeking ultimate power, and we're back to the question of if anyone, good or bad, should be allowed that much power. Defeating Maximilian is an exorcism, but it's also a warning of how power can ruin everything.